where truth and fiction collide. You're listening to John Christie. This is the intersection of Christianity and culture.
All right, well, welcome back to the John Christie podcast. And today I will be talking with a Christian author, Greg Hall. Greg is the host of the Rethinking Scripture podcast, where he challenges listeners to rethink what they think they already know about the Bible. And he's also written a book, and the book is to do that exact thing, to rethink. It's called Rest: Why Our Approach to the Sabbath Isn't Working. In his book, Greg gives us a perspective on what it means to rest, at least in the biblical sense of the word rest, and how that applies to us, to Christ, and to the Sabbath. So let's go ahead and get started in this conversation with Greg Hall. And Greg, welcome onto the podcast.
Hey, thanks, John. I'm excited to be here and always look forward to talking about rest with people.
All right. So before we jump into the book, give us a little bit of your background, who you are, where you come from, and let's get to why the book Rest.
Yeah. I just bought a shirt this last week that says upper left. And that's like a thing for Washington, the state, because it's in the upper left-hand corner. Okay. I've lived my whole life in the upper left, though. I was born up in Seattle. I kind of moved and migrated down early to the Salem, Oregon area, about an hour south of Portland, and went to school back up in Washington and came back home. So I've lived in the upper left portion of the United States, the Northwest. For the majority of my life. I've married my high school sweetheart, and we're still married. Can you even believe that? That doesn't happen all the time.
When did you start dating in high school? Was it freshman year, sophomore year?
So there's 2 years difference, which is huge when you're in high school. It's not so big when you're 54, but when you're in high school and you're a senior guy checking out a sophomore girl, that's almost scandalous, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I noticed her in a PE class the first day of school and asked a few questions of some friends that knew her. And probably took a good 9 to 12 months to get things put together. And so we dated for 4 years, got married when we were both in college. It's one of those stories that oftentimes they don't come together or they don't stay together, but ours has worked well. We have 2 sons. They're in their, I used to say mid-20s. Now I've got to say upper 20s. They're 26 and 28. So they're getting up there in age. Like I said, we live in Salem, Oregon, and we are lucky enough to live on 5 acres about 5 minutes outside of town. And it just seems like we're in the backwoods part of the world, but we're really close to town. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Let me go back for a second. I don't want to let you go too far before we acknowledge. So you've been married how many years?
Oh, goodness. I was married in 1990, December of 1990. So we're coming up on 34 years.
Wow. Congratulations, man. That's quite an accomplishment nowadays.
Yeah.
And any
No,
days, to be honest.
It's been a journey like every marriage is, and wouldn't have chosen anything different. So, yeah.
So we are celebrating actually this month. June 25th will be our 30th anniversary. So we're not quite there where you are, but we're following behind.
Very good. Yeah. So it's the same road, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I love her. She loves me, and doesn't mean everything's been great and everything's been wonderful, but she's the one I want to work through all the differences with. So, it's a good thing. I love being married.
Yep. We often say we got married so young. She was still 19 when we got married. I was 22. I was 21, almost 22. She was almost 20. But we look back at how clueless we were at the beginning there.
I know.
And we literally say, knowing what we know, and I think you can say this about a lot of things in life, knowing what I know now, I'm not sure I would have made the same decision, but thank God that I did, because we would have never gotten to where we are now. But man, we were just ignorant as all get out. And
the amazing thing is you thought you knew everything. And I can remember clearly, I knew everything. I didn't need anyone to tell me. But I look back now and I think, number one, no, I didn't know nearly anything that I thought I knew. And I was such a baby. And I look at people now that are 21. I was married at 21. She was 20. So very similar to you. And wow, I'm just like blown away at how young. I don't know if we were older. I felt like we were older, but probably weren't. Probably just the same.
Yep. So we lived for just a short time up in Tacoma. I was a school teacher, taught junior high English for 3 years, and I loved it. But that's just not sustainable. Junior high, number one, is just a really tough age to teach. And junior high English has got to be the worst subject that on the lot. So we did that for 3 years, moved back to our hometown, and I sold real estate for a good portion of my life, like 18 years.
Oh, wow.
And then did well, had a great market during the time I was selling, and then 2008 happened. And if your audience is at all familiar with the financial market and the history of what's been going on, 2008 was just a really bad year for real estate and a lot of other things in our financial sector. So that precipitated a move out of real estate and into pastoring. So I was a pastor for 10 years here locally in the Salem area where we live. And I did that for 10 years, and then I got my doctorate while I was there. And then I've done some adjunct teaching at some Bible college in the area.
Did you, when you pastored, did you start the church, or did you go into a church that was already established? Yeah,
I was an associate pastor the whole time. So I was never a head pastor. And I actually I got hired as a high school pastor only. So that was my only responsibility when I got hired. As is the case with a lot of churches, and we went through some transition, and that transition caused needs to be covered in different areas as people came and left and all of that. So over my 10 years, I did high school, I did junior high, I did young adults, college age, I did Christian education for adults. I was a small group pastor. I launched a small group ministry. I preached every so often. I helped out with VBS, had to memorize lines and play roles up on stage for VBS.
Okay.
Which was always great, but it was always just the worst week of my life because I was like, I don't want to get up there and mess something up for these kids,
Sure. Start
talking theology maybe. So, great time. Good. I was supposed to be there when I was there, and I was supposed to be leaving when I left. So, as God does with, I think a lot of people, not just pastors, right? He calls us to places for times, and then tells us when it's time to move on. And I've always felt like that was the case for me. I've been in a lot of different places from the work that I do, and I always felt called there, and then I've always felt released at some point and found my next thing.
And was that next thing being an author?
Well, part of that, yeah. So, like I said, I got my doctorate while I was pastoring.
Yep.
I had gotten a master's in theology while I was doing real estate. So it's like I'm setting up the next thing that I'm going to do. So when I left there, I had the opportunity to do some adjunct teaching some Bible classes. So I've taught some theology classes at the college level, Old Testament survey, New Testament survey, things like that. And so I did that for several years. And then during the pandemic, my only sibling, my sister, Jody, passed away unexpectedly. She was 54. She's the age I am now. And she just went to bed and didn't get up in the morning. She had a heart attack, I guess, or a heart event is what they said. So,
oh, wow.
And I've got an elderly mom that lives with us. And so I sort of exited the teaching scene for a little while, and I'm taking care of my mom. And that also precipitated being able to finish my book that I've been working on for, 14 years, something like that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the accomplishment of writing a book, the process, the accomplishment. I've had so many book ideas and thoughts about writing a book, and I've even started outlines because that's the only way I could see myself getting through it is, outline everything down several levels and then just write to each of those points. And hopefully, at the end of it, you've got something worth reading and big enough. But that has to be such a difficult process to go through to write a book.
Well, it was a multi-stage for me. So we'll get into the topic in a little bit, but the idea, some of the original ideas came to me while I was a real estate agent going through my master's program. So master's in theology, one of the things they have you do is take survey courses. So I was marching my way through the Bible, and I noticed some things that were of interest, new to me in the book of Hebrews. And that started my wheels going. So like you, I started outlining some thoughts and different things, started a blog. And then as I got to my doctorate degree, I turned it into my doctoral thesis. So this is a long drawn out process. And then nobody, even the people you pay, nobody likes reading doctoral theses. So I figured out if I'm going to have anybody read this thing, I've got to rewrite it and make it a little more enjoyable. So I taught a class at my church, a 7-week class, and each of those weeks turned into a chapter in the book, and it's written in a very conversational way. So that was my route, and hopefully if I try it a second time, it won't take the exact same path because I'll be an old man by the time the second book comes out. But having been through it once, I think I can skip a few of those decades that I worked on it.
So you have a topic, and I understand what you mean. Through doing other things, sometimes at unexpected moments, these thoughts start coming in and they start developing into something. But there's got to be more of a I guess for lack of a better phrase, I'll just say there's got to be more of a reason why you chose the topic of rest. Maybe was it something more personal? I mean, of all the topics that you can write about coming out with a book of theology, why rest? What was it?
Yeah. And I would say for some authors, and maybe even me in the future, for some authors, there's some defining moment in their life that causes them to go down a topical road and research something and then write about it. For me, literally, the way this thing progressed, I was surprised by my study in the book of Hebrews, by something that I thought I kind of knew. I had studied before, and then marching through it in a certain way, in a certain cadence, I saw something that I hadn't seen before. And then I started looking and asking questions. is there anybody else that has written about this insight that I think I have? And I'm being vague in general right now because I think a lot of us, especially those of us that study the Bible, sometimes we think we see something, and then that should be really the next step is there, who else is writing about this? Because I don't want to be the only guy that sees something because maybe I'm just seeing stuff I shouldn't be seeing at that point. But and I started looking, I started asking questions, researching, and I wasn't finding anybody else that was looking at it exactly the same way. There were some similarities in different people, but and then I started bouncing it off people that I knew and respected, in the faith and in the academic community, and I got some good feedback, and that just caused me to be more interested. So, what usually starts on the personal level for me started in the academic level, and after I went down those roads about what Hebrews has to say about rest, chapters 2 and 3 specifically, what some of those things that I thought I found, the conclusions that they led to, it really meshed nicely with the chaos of my life at any given moment. And I began to say, okay, this is not academic only anymore. It is now backed its way into the personal side of my life, and it has become an effective way for me to understand what I'm going through. And that is all I can say. It's been life-changing from that direction. And I just started maybe a little backwards than some authors do. Instead of meeting some personal need that I had at the beginning, God, I think, just, opened my eyes in a certain way and allowed me to go down a path that eventually spoke into my life exactly when I needed it.
So, and I know to this point, you've been, like you said, you've been vague, and we're going to get into those details more and talk. But I'll tell you this. So knowing that I would have you on the show, I wanted to read the book, and I didn't know what I was expecting from it. I really didn't have much expectations. And by that, really what I mean is I just thought, we'll see, what it has to say. I didn't really expect, to enjoy it as much as I did, to be completely frank with you, just because, and not to say that I thought I was not going to like it at all, but I just really got into the book, to be honest. And a main reason why is you touched on a lot of points that I have seen, that I have spoke about, that I have taught, that I've, you're dealing with the curse in the garden. You're dealing with Hebrews 10, different parts to this. I just found myself really saying, wow, this is exactly, what I've thought or what I've read, what I've taken out of this. And it really impressed me. Not to say, I hope that doesn't sound as egotistical as I think it may have just sounded, but it's not that I was impressed that you thought like me, but I was impressed at the depth of what you were pulling out of these passages that often goes overlooked or just glossed over in a sense, if I can put it that way.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. Like I said, this what you read was an adaptation of a doctoral thesis. So there is depth in the book that I've written, and I've masked that depth with personal stories and a conversational style and movie quotes and analogies, and tried to make it as interesting as possible. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
that's good. There's something about having these ideas in your head and then going through the process of working it out to get it on paper in a coherent way. And then I'm just over the last few months since the book came out, handing somebody a book, and I can tell when I hand it to them just what you said. You never know what you're going to get when you get a book handed to you, right? It could be a hit or a miss.
Yep.
And I know what's in this book, and it's really hard to convey that besides, just saying, my heart and soul's in this, and it's changed my life. So thank you for those kind words.
You're welcome. Yeah. So let's jump into it a little bit and, kind of start from the beginning, some of the questions you had, you pose in the beginning of it to kind of set the stage, and let's, go into some of the depth of what you mean by rest and why we're not getting it right, or most of us, I would say, are not getting it right at this time, and what that means. Again, understanding it's a book and you want people to go read it, so we don't want to give away everything, but let's go a little bit into details with it. And in the very beginning, you kind of open it posing a few questions to set the stage. What day is the Sabbath? We always associate rest with the Sabbath day, whether it's the seventh day, or Christians have made it more the Sunday day of rest. And then you ask, how do you interact with the concept of rest? And how does rest influence your life on a weekly or monthly basis? And you kind of set the stage first, just kind of by shaping rest. So can we kind of start there and talk a little bit about those things and what the concept, or maybe the misconception of rest is? And then we'll get into more of the application and some of the scripture that you use.
Yeah. So it's interesting when I call my book a biblical theology of rest, and that just means that I've gone and tried to look at the topic of rest throughout the entire Bible. So starting in Genesis all the way through to the end of Revelation, what does the Bible have to say about rest? And it's interesting that when we talk about rest as modern day Christians, we've been kind of programmed to think about this topic in terms of an observance of a Sabbath one day a week, the weekly Sabbath. And that comes directly from the fourth commandment, obviously. Exodus chapter 20, Deuteronomy chapter 5 are the places where that fourth commandment are laid out. In the Old Testament, like you said, Friday night to Saturday night, their days started in the evenings. And so Friday night to Saturday night was the original Sabbath. The fourth commandment, the observance once a week of that Sabbath. Hot topic. What happens when we get to the New Testament and Jesus does his work and ascends? One of the conclusions was, we just moved a day over to Sunday because that's the day that he rose from the dead. And that was the mantra for a long period of time. And so that's fairly well ingrained in our society to think of this topic of Sabbath as one day a week, and historically for Christians, maybe Sunday. Small movement of people within the church think we should go back to the Old Testament observance, but most people are heading the other direction. They took Martin Luther's promptings in the 1500s, and he said, it doesn't have to be Sunday. It could be any day of the week. And then we've even taken that to the next extreme of piecemealing parts of a day, 2 hours here on a Tuesday and 4 hours on a Friday and maybe half the afternoon on Saturday. And that's my Sabbath. We've piecemealed. The problem is all of those concepts are focused on the Sabbath being only that fourth commandment, that one day a week idea. And when I went back into the Bible and looked at it from a biblical theology standpoint, I backed away from only the fourth commandment, like we've been kind of programmed to do in our society. And I noticed there was a lot more to Sabbath theology than just one day a week. Going back to the Old Testament, obviously the idea starts at the creation on the seventh day of creation. And then within the law of Moses, there's more than just that fourth commandment. And I just started asking the question, why is it that when we talk about Sabbath, why is it we're not talking about everything that the Bible has to say about Sabbath? Why is it that we're only seemingly focused on one day? And interestingly enough, where that's actually led is most people have no view about what Sabbath is today because it's been largely abandoned. People aren't confused by it anymore because they don't even think about it anymore. And that's where some of those questions at the beginning were meant to prompt, hey, does this idea of Sabbath even cross your plate on a weekly or a monthly basis? Do you even think about it anymore? Or is it just one of those things that you've put on the back shelf and have kind of forgotten about it?
Now, one of the things that I always look at in the Bible, we're blessed in the day and age that we are in to have hindsight, to see it as in a sense, a completed book. We have the complete of the New Testament and the Old Testament. We can look back and see how the Old Testament basically sets us up for the New Testament to reveal to us. And this is one of those topics that, there's a lot of questions and things that we hear from Jesus. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Then he does work in a sense, whether it was healing or harvesting, eating a few grains of wheat or something like that on the Sabbath. And he lays out the idea of, if you're so focused on the literal meaning of these laws, these rules, these precepts, then you're completely missing the point of them. We have that benefit to look back, that it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, but what comes out of him that makes him unclean. Those types of thoughts. And we can look back at the Sabbath now, and you ask the question, does God expect believers today to practice Sabbath? And on one hand, that's hard to just answer without having a more qualifying question of, what do you mean by Sabbath? In a sense, right?
Yeah, totally. And that was the hook in Hebrews, actually, because in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, it goes into this argument about how Joshua, that character in the Old Testament that followed Moses, leading Israel into the promised land, if he had actually given those people rest, the true rest that's offered, that God or David through a psalm that, God helped him with, obviously, through inspiration, would not have spoken of another day after that, another type of rest. And then the conclusion in the book of Hebrews, and again, Hebrews is important because it's post-cross. These are, we can read Jesus's words, but a lot of Jesus's words need to be put in the context of, hey, he hasn't died on the cross yet. So he's going to synagogue, but people after didn't go the same route. So he observed Sabbath, the fourth commandment, during his lifetime. But then the question should be, is anything different after the cross event, after his ascension to heaven? So the conclusion in Hebrews 4:9 is that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And I think it's interesting the way it's phrased. It doesn't say there remains a Sabbath day for the people of God. It's talking about maybe a larger idea or larger conception of the idea of Sabbath. And even the fourth commandment, though, points to something bigger than itself. If you go to Exodus 20, it says, the fourth commandment starts, remember the Sabbath day. And we, in the way we read that modern day, is we think they're talking about the observance of one day a week where we do something different. Remember that one day a week you should do something different. But the Sabbath day there is defined down at the end of the commandment in verse 11. He says, and he takes us back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And he rested on the seventh day. And now listen how it finishes. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So even the fourth commandment, when it says remember the Sabbath day, it's not saying remember to do something one day a week. It's saying remember what happened on the seventh day of creation, because that is the key to this whole thing. And I think we've misunderstood, some of us, the way it's been taught. Some of us have misunderstood maybe what happened on that seventh day of creation.
So you have that seventh day, and creation is completed. And God has put things into order. God has set things a certain way. And now, in a sense, he can enjoy the process that's taking place in his creation. Things are growing the way they should. Animals are acting the way they should. Man is now going to do his level of work. He's going to name the animals. He's going to cultivate the earth. And then we get to Genesis 3. And I'll read just a little snippet, an excerpt from your book, and then I'll let you talk a little bit more about this, because I found this to be just excellent, the way you dealt with this and the idea of order and rest and how they're related. So in the book you say, their choice, they being Adam and Eve, their choice to eat from the tree was an effort to subvert his rule and gain the wisdom necessary to create their own system, to their own glory. It's first called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but we later find out that they understood it to be a source of ordering wisdom. With that type of wisdom, they could create their own order and bring glory to themselves instead of God. Can you talk about that a little bit and what happened after that seventh day in creation?
So I simplify the idea of the first 6 days of creation by just saying that God's giving everything a place to be and a thing to do. That's obviously an oversimplification of the ideas and the complexity of what's going on. But he's giving, let's say, like the land and the sea and the creatures and the luminaries, and he's giving everything order out of chaos or out of non-order, depending on how you want to define it. And not just a place to be, but something to do, a way to function that is proper. And he does that for humanity too. And that's, I think, probably the key that should come out of this is God gives humanity a place to be and a thing to do within his function and order for the universe. We are to be fruitful and multiply. We are to rule and subdue. Later in the garden story, it's cultivate and keep the garden. These are all things that are God things, by the way, right? Ruling and subduing, that's a God thing. And he pulls humanity in to the process and invites us to work with him in that role. And then the first 6 days end, and I call it the Great Cessation. Sabbath is just a word for ceasing, stopping. And we've assumed that stopping, the ceasing of Sabbath, means stopping everything. No work is to be done. And I was often told that's what happened on day 7 of creation, is God actually took a day off. But there's some clues within that seventh day context that suggest that it's not that he's taking a day off and not doing anything, but that he has ceased a certain type of work. And if we look at the story that way, what type of work does he cease? He ceases that work of giving function and order to the cosmos. And why is he able to cease that? Because it's very good. It's good all along the way, which just means everything's in their place doing the thing they were made to do. But then by the end, all the pieces together is very good. Everything's working the way it was created to do. Everything's in its place and doing its thing.
So let me use Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, so let me use an analogy from my life as to why, how this resonates with me so well. And hopefully this can, apply to many people in their thinking. But in my career, I phrase myself as a software consultant, but what I am in a technical meaning is I'm what's called a solution architect. And what I do is design systems specific. There's a couple specific that we work with, but software systems to work together in processes more automated than manual, because that makes things run more efficient and takes advantage of the technology and allows it to connect to other systems and talk back and forth, right? So it's kind of a simple way of explaining what I do. Now, in doing that, every project that I'm on, every new client that I'm dealing with, we could, in a sense, start from scratch and come up with a complete, fresh design of everything. But that's not really that efficient. And what we do is we apply what we call design patterns or best practices, known more commonly in like business. And there's best practices that say, this is the way things should be done. Here's how water will flow will flow down as opposed to flowing up. And that's due to gravity, obviously, or whatever. But there's these best practices that we put in place. And in doing that, we're allowed to create very efficient and stable systems because these practices have been tried and true. And then we, in a sense, tweak them for our clients. So when I'm hearing this, to me, it makes complete sense, because what this is saying is, in a sense, God put things in order, and at the point where now everything's been what we would call implemented, everything's been implemented and built out, the system has been completed and deployed to production so we can use it now in our day-to-day work. I can sit back, in a sense, and rest, take a moment to admire this system that's been put together and see how everybody uses it, which in a sense would be their level of work. But there's enjoyment to that. There's benefit to that because now they're getting their job done. They're doing things faster. Again, things are more automated rather than manual. They're not as difficult to do because they're working within my well-designed system that has been put into place and everything's running smooth. And that, to me, that's why this resonates so well with me, because I completely get it. God as the solution architect sitting back and saying, look at the people, doing their business, doing their work, enjoying it with this new, well-produced system, and everything's flowing and operating the way it should until someone does something. Someone inserts that variable and things start breaking and are not working. Now people start getting frustrated. Now people start complaining. Now people feel like they can't get their work done, or it's more difficult to get their work done. And now they can either continue going down this path of working in a broken system and having struggles, or they can come back to the solution architect and say, how do we fix this? How do we improve this? I don't want to jump too far ahead, but that's what I took from it.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And not having been in the software realm at that level, that didn't come to mind. But as you explained it, that makes total sense. I can see how that clicked on for you. One of the things that surprised me as I went back and studied that creation account in a little more detail is at the end of each of the first 6 days, you've got this literary device that the author uses to end and start days. There was evening and morning, day X, the day 1 or day 2. And this is a literary device, that repeat of there was evening, there was morning. That ends one day and starts another day. And the author uses it for the first 6 days of creation. So there was literally evening and morning, no question about that. So it's a literal thing that he's describing, but it's also a literary device that he's using to move the story along. Interestingly enough, when he gets to day 7, that literary device is abandoned. So day 7 doesn't have the moniker at the end, and it was evening and it was morning, and we moved on to day 8. And I'm not questioning whether day 8 ever happened, because I went to bed last night, I got up, and it's a new day for me, and I suspect for everyone.
Right.
But from a literary standpoint, what that means is day 7 is categorically different than days 1 through 6. There's something very different about it. And at least from a theological standpoint, is my argument, day 7 never ended. The author chose not to end it literally, and therefore something in the theological events of that day continued past that day. And this is the reason I'm spending a little bit of time on this, is because it's often taught that day 7 of creation in the beginning of chapter 2 in Genesis was only a literal 24-hour period of time. And I'm not questioning 24-hour period. I'm not going into those arguments at all. I know them well. They're great arguments to have. I'm just saying from a theological standpoint, the event, the activity, the rest, in other words, that God entered into, and all of creation with him. The rest that creation entered into on day 7 was intended and did continue into day 8 and 9 and 10 until, like you mentioned, something happened in chapter 3. And what is it that happened? So we all know the story, so I'm not going to repeat it. But from my book's perspective, from the perspective of rest, Adam and Eve are living in the garden in chapter 3 for a period of time. We don't know exactly how long. And they are following the rules. They are, in other words, they're in their place and they're doing their thing that God would have them do. They're not eating of a certain tree. It's a trust relationship. I don't need to know that. But then that changes, whether it's by their own thoughts or the suggestion of a serpent. It's suggested that that tree has something that could make you just like God. And from a rest standpoint, what that tree does is it invites them back into the first 6 days of creation. Something that is finished, something that is very good, something that God ceased from, the great cessation. Never meant to go back into the first 6 days and reorder. But when Adam and Eve ate of the tree, they began a process of saying to themselves, I think I can reorder this thing a little better than God did. I don't think I trust that he has the best practices from your analysis, right? And I think I'm going to try and create a new function and order, go back, travel back into the first 6 days, something that was determined by God to be very good, but I think I can do it better. And as arrogant as that sounds for Adam and Eve, to some degree, it's exactly what we do in our own lives. Because we've been invited into that same trust relationship of trusting that God has set up a function and order for the cosmos under which it functions best, under which we as humans, not just the individual humans, but humanity as a whole, that we function best when we operate a certain way.
Yep.
And when we trust God to do that, that he knows best and we follow his direction, we have the opportunity to slip into a trust relationship with him that brings rest into our life. It's more of a rest for our souls than it is for our physical bodies. But that's really what Jesus was offering as well. You remember his statement, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. And we like to think that he's talking about my physical rest, my physical weariness and heavy ladenness. But then he goes on and says, come to me and you will find rest for your soul. And so really, when the Bible talks about rest, it's a trust relationship that God knows how this thing works best. And that when we slip under his rule and authority as the creator and do the thing that we were created to do under his authority, we can experience a rest that's not available if we go out and try and do that on our own.
All right. I don't want to make this too much about software and my solution architecture, but I've got to go down this path a little bit more with the analogy because this is so accurate and it's so it's so precise in its meaning and its practicality and how this plays in our life. And we say these things that you're saying, and I 100% agree with you. And I think oftentimes we still struggle though because of our resistance. And so let me put it this way. So carrying through my analogy, and I won't keep doing this all night long, but I do have to go down this path just a little bit again. So now, again, I've designed this software system and people are using it. And one of the big things we deal with is what we call user adoption, which is people getting used to using a new system. They've been on one system for a while, and as soon as you have people work on a different system and a button isn't where it used to be, or something doesn't act the way it does, or even just the change of a color, it can throw people into chaos. And all of a sudden, they're upset because everything's changing at work and they get very flustered. So we deal with that a lot in how to gently get people into this new system. Once they're there, they can either get it and understand the end goal of what we're trying to do, or be resistant to it. And some of the resistance can come where, just as examples, when I try to put letters in the phone field and it won't let me, and it's telling me only numbers, and I can be resistant to that and say, why would a good God not allow me to put letters in a phone field? If God's so loving, wouldn't he let me put what I want to put in there? Well, there's a reason why, because there's greater purposes beyond just what you're doing with that phone number field that need to be accomplished. And we can't do it properly unless it's entered properly, unless the behavior is done properly. You can see where I'm going with that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then, you have greater things that are even more important that have to do with types of data and all this information that needs to be captured because it affects reports that roll up to finance, or it can affect something that happens, in a warehouse for distribution, or something that you have nothing to do with and you don't see it on a day-to-day basis. But the data you're putting into the system directly affects those other parts. And these are the types of things in a well-run system that sometimes we just have to, I would say trust, but I would more say when it comes to, users actually interfacing with some software, you just have to follow the rules. And you might not fully understand the rules, and it doesn't make sense to you. And why do I have to do this step? This is so stupid. I shouldn't have to do this. I should be able to bypass this and do something else. And when you do that, maybe the system catches you and says you can't do that, or maybe it is allowed, but now you've screwed up something else again in a warehouse, or something that finance isn't getting and they're not invoicing now and it's affecting our revenue, or whatever it might be. But the point being is that these systems obviously get more, they always trend towards more complexity. They never get simpler over time. And there's more reliance on accurate data. And this is what, these are all the commercials you see and everything that everybody's fighting for and trying to perfect, because this is how the world operates now on these systems, and having them have accurate data, quickly accessible, easily reportable, and we can do things fast, and we can be progressive that way, and we can, make technological leaps when all this stuff is in place and working well. When it's not working well, everything falls apart. And we start operating in chaos. And then what we do is we get trapped, and we see this all the time with clients, in constantly trying to make our chaos work rather than go the new path, follow the new rules, follow the direction you're supposed to go. Again, those best practices. We continually keep working in the same old systems, doing things in a sense the wrong way, hoping that we'll eventually get the correct results. And it doesn't come about. It never does. So I get it, and I'm hoping, by giving those sorts of analogies sometimes, because again, people that I deal with, whether it's atheists or even amongst Christians at times, what I see a lot is this resistance, in a sense, to trust, to have faith in God, that these things better than I do. And if I follow your ways, things will work out properly. If I resist your ways and go about them in my way and keep trying to bang my head against the wall, putting letters into a phone number field or whatever it may be, things aren't going to work out well. And I'm going to be more and more frustrated, i.e., I won't be at rest. I won't be at peace because I keep trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Am I there with you?
Yeah. No, I love the analogy, and I love the complexity that you've taken it to, because I think that complexity mimics the, just in a small way, the complexity of the universe. You've got like in the book of Job, you've got Job questioning God, and his responses to those, I'm not going to go into detail, but his responses to Job's questions are like, are you kidding me? You have no idea what I am doing out there in the universe. You are not there when all these things happen that I am superintending to, and you think that you know what's best, but that's from your perspective. And so this whole thing, but your software analogy assumes that there was a creator of the software that knows best how that software should run on that hardware. And the problem is most people don't have the trust out there in the world today, in the secular, economy that we have. Most people don't have the trust that there is a software designer that created this whole universe. And that's kind of the whole, origins debate that we're going through right now. Intelligent design has tried to speak into that, same topic. And if you never come to the conclusion that there is somebody that has organized this thing that we call life and this planet and this universe, if you never come to the conclusion that somebody organized that, it makes sense that you would try and organize it on your own.
Yeah.
But the problem is, how are we doing with that? I mean, it's pretty obvious that we suck at that. We're just horrible at making our own systems because, theologically, we would say because of the fallen nature, because of the corruption of sin, and we think selfishly, and all of, we can give all the topics and reasons from a theological standpoint. But you just ask the normal person who doesn't believe in God, hey, how's it going? Are we figuring this out? Are we doing well? And I got to believe most people would say, yeah, this is a mess. This is it's not working. Everybody seems to be looking out for themselves, which is interesting because when Jesus came, he was the one that said, you need to be the one that doesn't look out for yourself first. You need to look out for others first. And that's how this whole thing works well.
Yeah.
Which is just really interesting to me.
And, the Bible speaks to a lot of things specifically, but it also leaves a lot of room for us to apply what it does speak to, to everything, right? To create, in a sense, principles, best practices, and apply them to things. And we often talk about this type of following the rules in a sense of God's system. One of the areas, over, I don't know, maybe the last 15 years that I've seen just increasing more and more and more, and even within my own family, is things like gay marriage, same-sex couples. And we have in our family a same-sex couple that has adopted sons, and they have issues with some of them, some of the boys that as they've grown up, but there's Christians that also have issues with their children as they've grown up. It's not pointing to whether or not you raise children perfectly, but if you're following God's order of things, you have a much higher chance of achieving the results that God has intended in that order. When we're not following that order, i.e., in this case, gay marriage, raising children, not to say that two gay parents couldn't love children. I've seen it. Again, in my own family, I've seen it. But if God has established an order, and that order is that a husband and wife, a male and a female, a man and woman, and we're not going to get into all the different levels of gender identities and stuff, other to say, I'll be controversial enough to say I believe in the biological male and the biological female being the husband and the wife and raising a family. If we have that nucleus, I would wager that 100-1 over any other mixed setup that there would be of same sex or different gender identities, trying to raise a family. I think raising a family is difficult enough. Everybody has their issues. But if we're straying further and further from that order, we have much, again, back to my software analogy, we have much less of a chance of being successful. It's already hard enough to be successful within the order. Straying from it makes it even more difficult. I'll extend that to this and then I'll let you comment. And I just had this conversation this weekend with a young man, I'm thinking probably around 29 or 30 years old, and his girlfriend, and we were talking about marriage. And in the topic, I had mentioned we're celebrating our 30th, and they were, oh, congratulations. And they've been dating for 6 years, and they have no intention of getting married. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because number one, 2/3 of marriages end up in divorce. They knew I was religious, and they said, even amongst Christians, it's no different. What's really the point? And this has become very common now with, I don't know if it's millennials but somewhere in the 20s, maybe early 30s, this has kind of become the norm. I see it more often, even amongst my nieces and nephews and my own children and people. No one's in a rush to get married. No one is really considering it as much. And I shouldn't say no one. I know I'm generalizing, but it's become more and more popular. And my point to him was, well, the reason why marriage is so important is because whether you're religious or not, it's establishing a commitment, what we in Christianity would call a covenant, but it's establishing a commitment between people. And without that commitment, you have no basis to start a true relationship of a family with, because without that commitment, at anyone's whim, they can do what they please. Granted, I know you can do that even once you're married. People get divorced and leave people. But if you're not even willing to make the commitment, if you're not even willing to go to that step, then in a sense, I don't think you have much of a chance at all to have this order working properly. And he said, oh, no, I'm willing to make a commitment to her. I'm just saying we don't need to be married. That's kind of an outdated thing. And I said, what do you think marriage is? It's more than just a document, a legal document. It's a commitment of you giving yourself. This is why we do vows. This is what we say is, I'm going to put you ahead of me. I'm going to give my life to you. I'm going to work towards this relationship with us, and I'm not going to abandon it. And he said, well, yeah, that's the way we think. We just are not getting married. And ironically, he said, we get along really well. We love each other right now, but we have no idea where things are going to be 10 years from now. So rather than complicate it, we like to just leave our options open so that we can, take things as they come and do whatever we feel we need to do at those moments. And I said, so that's not a commitment. That's a temporary acknowledgement of us being together, but it's definitely not a commitment, because what a commitment does is it says, even when things aren't working out, I'm going to be committed to you to work with them. Now, things like abuse and things like that aside, I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about to what he had mentioned with feelings, with, changes in life, and maybe I don't want to be in this anymore. There's no commitment there. So you can pretend, in a sense, that you're in this committed relationship because right now you guys are staying together, but you're not committing to one another. And what you do see in the Christian model, at least of this, is it's not just between, and this is what I was telling him, it's not just between me and my wife. It's between me, my wife, and God. And we have a responsibility and accountability to him, not just each other. And so when we have that feeling of a lack of commitment or a desire to get out of this or abandon this or whatever it may be, over the years, over 30 years, it has not always been, pure love and wonderful. There's been hardship in there. But with God, because we're committed to God as well as committed to one another, we've worked through these things and we've come to know each other and God greater because of it. But without that willingness to commit, there is no sub-commitment. There is no, any other version of a commitment. Again, I would say it this way. Without the willingness to follow the rules and enter strictly numbers into a phone number field, there is no other option of, well, but sometimes I can put letters in there and it'll still work out the same. It doesn't work out the same because that's not the way it was ordered. I know I said a lot and I maybe kind of rambled on there, but I'll let you comment.
Yeah. So I think that anybody that's read the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, can see an emphasis on covenants. There's whole fields of study out there about the different covenants that God makes with humanity and with different people groups within humanity. And what the Bible is clear about is that the covenant of marriage, however that's defined, and again, not to get into the weeds, but the covenant of marriage is a reflection not just of an earthly agreement between two people, but it's an agreement between parties that then reflects something of our covenant with God. And so to the extent that we are in our place doing our thing the way God would have us do it with the covenant of marriage, we get to know God better through an earthly example of working with another human. And if we're not doing that correctly, the picture of our relationship with God is at jeopardy. And I don't mean that to say we'll never get it, but the clear picture, to the extent that we don't reflect things clearly in the physical realm of things in the unseen realm, we can't picture what that relationship might truly be. For instance, God also describes himself as Father, right? That's the way he's described in the Bible. For some people, they, had a horrible earthly father, and that has just ruined that terminology for the concept of who God is. But horrible fathers aren't the way God intended them to be. So if you've got a father, for instance, that is in his place doing the thing God would have him do at any given moment under God's rule and authority, he may not be a perfect father, but he's going to be at least relatively reflective of the relationship that we have with our Heavenly Father. We're going to learn things through these earthly relationships that we couldn't learn otherwise. We wouldn't know with such specificity if we're not doing it correctly here in the physical realm. So I don't know if that makes sense, but covenant is a huge part of the biblical story. And people forget that the idea of marriage is a covenant. It is a spiritual entanglement, and it's a contract between two parties. I was in real estate, like I said earlier, for a large portion of my working career, and we entered into covenants. We called them earnest money agreements in Oregon over here, sales agreements. But it was just bringing two parties together and agreeing to a set of parameters for a relationship.
Yeah.
And that is centered around the transaction of moving one property out of one name into another. But when we think about covenants, there's not too many places, because of our individualistic Western society, there's not too many times we feel comfortable entering into covenants because we feel like it's constricting our freedom. It's constricting our freedom. It's constricting the way we would want to live life. And yet there's something about covenants that is very good. It's the way we were created to function. And if we do it well, I think, get a clearer picture of who God is. And if we stray too far and don't do it well, that picture gets fuzzy. It gets less defined. We don't know exactly, maybe what we don't see, we don't understand quite as well as we could. So I don't know if that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, that's great. And again, and I hope we're making the connection clear enough, because it's so impactful, because this is directly related to the topic of rest, the covenant, because to what you said, when you're in that covenant, yes, there is a restriction over you. I can't do everything I want to do. That's the way my marriage is. And the reason why is because there's another person, and then you add children, there are other people involved. It's not just about me and my desires. And if I live that way, I will end up in divorce. If I live that way where I satisfy myself over anyone else, I will end up in divorce, because ultimately I'm going to put myself always ahead of everyone else, ultimately to the point of I'll be alone in that. And when we give in to the covenant, give in to the commitment, and have that relationship, have those restrictions in place. Again, I can only enter numbers into a phone field. I shouldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I allow these restrictions to be in my life. What I end up finding is that even though others can perceive it as I'm being restricted, I see freedom. I see rest in it, because I'm not striving to work against the system. I'm not striving to go uphill. I'm working with the system. I'm enjoying the system, and I'm at peace. I'm at rest. Things fall into place and are better.
Yeah, I can see your computer software mind at work there. And I think it's confusing to some people. Again, marriage is a hot topic today, and divorce used to be the hot topic, and there will be other hot topics that come down the road. I think from a bigger, stepping away from any one individual hot topic and just looking back, I like the statement that you made that agreeing to a covenant seems like it's constricting, but it's actually giving you freedom. And what I would like to add to that is, what kind of freedom? Because that seems like an oxymoron. It seems like exactly the opposite. Why is it that I'm more free once I commit to a system or a structure? And in the biblical account, when I agree that God has created a function and an order for everything in the universe, and I'm a part of that universe, that means He's created a function, a place for me to be, something for me to do at every given moment of my life. I now have the freedom to not try and create a new system of order. My freedom is just finding out and focusing in on where I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think what we do oftentimes in our larger theological discussions is we get caught up in the macro discussion. The larger discussion about what is a woman is, the big topic now, or,
right.
or marriage, or just any of these hot topics. The macro discussions consume our life. But really what I think, when I read the Bible, what Jesus is offering in the New Testament is a personal trust relationship at the micro level. And He's offering that to each individual human. And so to some extent, I don't have to try and figure out the solution to all the hot topics of the world today. What really should be first and foremost on my plate any given day when I wake up is, what kind of an agenda have I set for myself? And is this within God's system, or is this something that I've created? Have I gone back into days 1 through 6 of creation, and the car that I see as I drive by the dealership today at noon on my lunch hour, and that I'm going to want, have I created a system in my life where I just buy everything I want? Or have I gone into a different system, and am I looking, instead of for what I want, maybe looking for things that God would bring across my plate on any given day?
Yeah, that's good.
Let me skip to Matthew 11:28. I've already commented just briefly on it, but it's this Matthew 10, 11, 12. These are all really important Sabbath related context or conversations that Jesus is having in the book, the Gospel of Matthew. And it's at the end of one of those, right in the middle of, those chapters, at the end of one of those conversations, that Jesus does say, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden." And again, I'm defining that as soul weariness and soul heavy ladenness, first and foremost. He's not talking about our physical condition because that can change on a whim, but our soul. He's offering, I will give you rest for your soul. And the next statement we gloss over because we don't fully understand it because we're not largely in an agricultural society. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke, he mentions the yoke again in verse 30, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And so I looked at that and I talked about it a little bit in my book. I addressed it again in more detail in my podcast. The yoke metaphor is used quite often in the Bible. So first and foremost, we need to be reminded that the yoke is that wooden harness that goes between two work animals that then has, reins that the driver of the cart or whatever the animals are pulling directs their path, right? So at a basic level and agricultural level, when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, what he's saying is you need to strap yourself to my guidance and my control as the one who holds the reins of my yoke. In addition to that, though, biblically speaking, the yoke metaphor comes into play in the picture of slavery. Pharaoh had a yoke that he placed. It was a heavy yoke. Solomon had a heavy yoke, and his son decided to make it heavier. And when we get to Jesus, he's not placing his yoke on anyone without their permission. We don't notice that in his offer. He is saying, will you voluntarily constrict yourself to my guidance? Take my yoke upon you. And if you do, I will give you rest. We're not talking about physical rest, because sometimes the places that God calls us to go do work and be the way he would have us be, it's exhausting physically. But some of those places, when we know we're exactly where we should be, we're in our sweet spot, in other words, some of those times when I'm exhausted because I know I'm doing the thing I'm supposed to be doing, my soul is at rest and my body is just ready to break down. And so I think we've mislabeled or misconstrued somewhere in our theology, we have come to the conclusion that the opposite of rest is work. Let me just say that again, because it took me a while to get through this paradigm shift. We have made the opposite of rest work. And so if we're working, there's no way we can be at rest in that logic. But looking at Jesus' offer in Matthew 11, take my yoke upon you and you will find rest. He's offering to say, those of you who are struggling to find your place to be and your thing to do the way I would have you do it, you can voluntarily submit to, let's say, a covenant, because we talked about covenants, but he calls it a yoke. I'll just say, I'm willing to put your yoke on my back, Jesus. I'm doing this willingly. Lead me to where I'm supposed to be. Show me the way I'm supposed to do it. And give me a rest that I can't find, that I have not been able to find when I try and do all those things on my own. I haven't been able to find that rest for my soul. Searching, playing the game the way I think it should be played, but I'm exhausted and my life is in disorder. So bring order back to my soul, bring order back to my life, bring order back to the world. That's the Christian message, right? It's not very American, unfortunately.
But in living in that order, again, that's where you find the peace. That's where you find contentment. And to one extent, it either takes a blind leap of faith to trust God in that. But if you've done it in small steps, you'll do it in larger steps, and you'll be able, once you know what that rest is, that peace, that contentment, that peace is really the great word that I love to use in that, of trusting in God, of resting in God. It's so true. The yoke is easy. The burden is light. It's so much easier and lighter than when I try to do it myself. And that's in a convoluted way what I've been trying to say all along, between the conversation with the young man about commitment, to the same-sex couple adopting children, to anything that I've spoken of, the software system and all that, is anything we recognize as not being right in the system is not the product of the system. It's the product of us not using the system properly. And we like to blame the system and try to fix it or change it. But again, this is something that, I see in my daily life, in my career, which is, business users who want to tell us how the system needs to operate, rather than what we'd say is, let us know your pain point, let us know where your problem is, and we'll show you how the system solves it, rather than always the dog chasing its tail type of thing. And that's what I see. And that goes back to the point with Jesus telling the Pharisees that it was because of the hardness of the heart. It's because when you're chasing after your own heart, you're chasing after selfishness, and you're constantly going to be trying to circumvent the system to appeal to your selfishness. And it's never going to operate right, and you're going to end up in worse and worse situations. When you submit your heart, you submit to Jesus's yoke, then you start using the system the proper way, and you find that rest, you find that peace, and you look back and say, this is the only way to do things. This is the right way to do things.
So interesting. Again, I like to bring it back to the micro levels, each individual person, because that's where it gets personal and applicable. We can get lost in bigger ideas, and those are very important conversations to have. I'm not discounting those at all. But just from a rest standpoint, we can talk about it theologically and symbolically, but I would just ask, and Jesus, I believe, is asking, where is it in your life that you are weary? Because we can be at rest at certain ways of doing things in our life. We can trust God in certain ways, in certain areas of our life. But the human condition is we're always trying to get a power grab at some point. We're always fighting that urge to go back into the first 6 days and reorder things. And that's what causes our weariness and heavy lateness. That, by the way, when Adam and Eve decided not to play by the rules, they got kicked out. They got exiled out of the garden, right? And they are doing the whole curse there in 3 and 4 is they are doing the same work outside the garden that they were going to be doing inside the garden, except now it's going to be with pain and toil. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. And I think we often think that's physical pain and physical toil because of the weeds and all the things. But I believe God is looking at that situation and saying, the work that I created you to do, you're now going to do it outside of my special place of presence in the garden. And you're going to try and have to figure it out on your own. And that will bring you pain and soul. Your soul will not be at rest anymore out there doing that work. It's the same pain in childbirth that Eve is described as having as a part of the curse there. She will have pain in childbirth. I'm not so sure that's talking about the physical discomfort of giving birth. That's the way it's always been explained to me, by the way, and again, I've got nowhere to stand on this because I haven't given birth, and there's no way I'm going to. But theologically looking at that, the pain in childbirth is now, what's the pain in childbirth? It begins, I talk about this a little bit in the book, it begins that day that she finds out she's pregnant. Because outside the garden, what's the situation? They had eternal, everlasting life inside the garden because of the access to the tree of life. But that access is now gone. And so we are living out our mortal lives outside the garden. And that woman knows the day she becomes pregnant, the day she gives birth, she knows the ultimate end of the life that she's giving birth to is death. And that, again, I don't want to get into any arguments with females that have given birth, but that has to be more painful than any temporary physical pain that anyone goes through, is the idea that I'm bringing a life into this world of chaos and disorder that will ultimately end in death. That's painful. And I think that was part of the exile, the story of Adam and Eve, chapter 3, 4. I believe that is the theological basis. Now, is life harder than it was inside the garden? Well, I think Adam and Eve probably, worked up a good sweat doing whatever they were doing. I'm not saying life inside the garden was just all lying in a hammock. I mean, they had work to do. And ultimately, they were to expand the borders of the garden. Mm-hmm. So as they became fruitful and multiplied, the garden would fill up and they would have to expand the borders so that it would eventually go out into that outside exiled world and bring God's order to the disorder, the chaos out in the world. And so, what's rest? How can we help not only ourselves ask that question today, where am I supposed to be and what am I supposed to do? Part of the answer every day is God's going to bring something across your desk where somebody's in a state of disorder or chaos. And you, as a part of God's administration, can bring order to that situation. You can help. And that's a very selfless act. Because, oftentimes when I get the knock on the door of chaos, I just want to shut it. I don't want to answer that. I don't want to answer those calls. As a pastor, it was like, oh, okay, I'm stepping into this. It's going to be exhausting, but it needs to happen because this is what God's bringing across my plate right now. And I've been skilled to deal with whatever it is, and this is my sweet spot. So let's go.
So I had a conversation this week with someone close to me, and they've struggled over the years. I guess just fully giving themselves to God. Knowing about God, knowing the knowledge of God, growing up in a Christian home, but just never really got involved. Just kind of, it was just not interested, understanding it, knowing God's there, whatever, Jesus, Savior, but just not giving of themselves to it. And within the last year, there's been a remarkable change on this person. And in talking with them, I said, what was it that really brought you to this change? Because a year ago, you were in a much different mental state, emotional state, altogether. And what is it? Knowing that they now are more focused on attending church, which I'm not trying to sound like that's what solves it, but they're more focused on God, attending church, reading the Bible, getting to know God, basically, right? Where before there just was not interest. And again, not that I'm saying that by stepping foot into a church, that's what happens, but it's more the submission, the giving of yourself, the submissive act of saying, I'm going to go and listen to a pastor teach about you. I'm going to open the book and read for myself, what the teachings of Jesus are. And in doing that, like I said, I've been noticing a change in this person. And I said, now you're open to things like praying. You're open to discussions about God in a much different way than before, where before it was very combative. Now it's become more learning. And they said, I just got tired of trying to handle everything myself. I just got tired of trying to do it all and feel like it was all up to me. And I just started with saying, okay, God, I'm just going to start relying on you. I've got this issue. I've got that issue. I'm just going to trust that you're doing something in that. And there's no big story here. There's no big amazing miracle that happened. Well, I think it is a miracle that happened, but not what we would think in a grand sense. But the miracle is that by just giving, in a sense, up of their will, and not even, I would say, 100%, but just to the point of saying, I'm open to you now. I'm willing to come to you now with some issues and trust that you're going to guide me. Not that you're going to do it all for me, but that you're just going to guide me. You're going to lead me. You're going to help. And then being, again, teachable, learnable, being put into situations like church or conversations with other Christians where you're willing to engage and learn and not be resistant. And they basically said, I just feel like now in my life, it's not all up to me. I don't feel the pressure and the stress of having to take care of everything and make sure it's right. My mental health, my work situation, my everything. But I'm more focusing on God and trying to give these thoughts, my actions even, to him. And in that, I'm starting to just sense more peace, more contentment. And I said, I think, what this is that when you stop focusing on yourself and you focus on God, and I would even say this is the same again in a marriage, when it's not all about you and you focus on your partner, you see it come back to you in a greater fold. The love you give comes back greater from your spouse in a marriage commitment. The dedication, the heart that you give to God comes back, I think, even greater from God. And it's not even necessarily that the circumstances may change dramatically, but it's your experience to them, your mindset about them, and having a trust in God really does give you a lot more release. It gives you a lot more rest in believing that there is this higher power that gives us, that is going to guide our path and correct things for us. And it might not always be the way that we want it to, but just even, I think, logically in that standpoint, just from a psychological standpoint, I think there's benefit to that. Now, the fact that I believe it to be real, I believe there's also a very tangible evidence to it as well in people's lives. And I'm witnessing this right now before my eyes in this person's life and seeing again, a remarkable change in them of just giving their will. And now they're like, they want to be in church again. Not that, don't get hooked on church being the end all, because that's not what I'm saying, but they're putting themselves in the environment where they're learning more of God. They're being more present with God, and it's making a remarkable change in their life. And I'm seeing them have that rest that they did not have a year ago.
Great. That's a great example. And I think, I would agree. I often say finding a community of believers. And if that's within a church building, great. If that is what works for you best. A lot of people, unfortunately, have been traumatized by what they experienced at church. So by just saying, hey, you got to get to church, that could take years of therapy to work through.
But again, that's the example of, and this is kind of, again, in my convoluted way, how I kept getting to it is, we're always trying to work around the broken parts of the system, or what we think is broken, the parts of the system that aren't working for us. But that doesn't mean that the system itself is broken. And more times than not, it becomes what we're doing that's broken, or what others did that's broken. Again, that hardening of hearts. The church order is a good thing. The fellowship of other Christians, it's a necessary thing. That's a very good thing. Yes, there are people that abuse that. There are people that are in power that have caused harm to people. That doesn't mean that order is bad. Again, it's just that people are doing a lot of bad things. And this is the way, to go back to your point where you said get from the macro to the micro level. The way I phrase that, and it's funny because I've talked with my kids about this type of thing, and I say, in the world, in culture, in society, I operate as a pragmatist. I deal with what is real in front of me and how people truly operate and work with that. In my own life, I'm an idealist, and I work towards the ideal being Christ, the model. And so I don't live where I'm always thinking that society should be a certain way, but I do live thinking I should be a certain way. And that's what I strive for in me. But in society, I kind of take it as it is and try to deal with it on that level. So I totally understand that and resonate with it, again, from the standpoint of, this is where it's, to me, the love your neighbors as you'd love yourself, love God with all your heart, mind, body, spirit. In my life, that's how I try to live, with a full expectation that there are many people out there that really don't even care about that. And in some cases, people that are directly looking to cause harm to others. So you got to be, I can't change that old, what is that saying? You can't change the world, but you could change the world in me type of thing. So that's kind of the way I try to apply it. But anyway, I'll let you get back in the conversation because I've been talking.
Well, and you just take a look at Jesus's life. You got a guy that knew the system. I mean, we're talking about the system, right? The place to be and thing to do. He knew that, not just for himself. He was part of the creation himself. I mean, he was there. He created the order. He knew it best of anybody. And he also was resigned to the fact that outside the garden, outside of God's rule, where people are looking, taking that yoke upon them, entering into that covenant set of boundaries, outside of that, what's going to happen to things that are good? I mean, they get persecuted, and they get beaten up, and they get crucified. And interestingly enough, and I know you have a classical study background, Plato came to the same conclusion in the secular world. I mean, you've got this ideal good, and what's the world going to do to it? It's going to crucify it. And that was before Jesus even showed up on the scene and played out what Plato came to understand, short of, acknowledging a higher God power like we would define it. The other thing that I mentioned in the book, and something you said earlier, was people get upset about not being able to be good Christians or living fully or things like that. I think sometimes we read the Bible and we forget what it says about characters. We think about like a guy like Moses, and we think, oh, great man of faith. He's in chapter 11 of Hebrews. He's just incredible. But it's interesting that characters like Moses had their high moments of faith, and then they had their great failures of faith.
Yeah.
And all along the way, they were people of faith. It was just in quantities. And I think you read the New Testament, Jesus gives a distinction that there are people of great faith and people of little faith. gives those qualifiers. And in the book, I talk about it in terms of a dimmer switch. Most of us have either one in our house in a bedroom, or we've seen one and played with it, and it's just totally fascinating. It's got a toggle switch that turns the power on and off, and then it's got a dimmer switch that goes up and down or side to side, and it just graduates the level of light in the room, not just on off, but you can go in gradations there. And I like to think of faith, biblical faith, being described in terms of that dimmer switch. You've got either it's turned on or off. And if faith is turned off in your life, and you're listening to this, oftentimes what the world will say is play with the dimmer switch. But we all know if the toggle's off, that dimmer switch doesn't do anything, right?
Right.
So it's time to figure out how to get that toggle on, right? And get power to the apparatus. And then what we should expect then, if we're reading the biblical text, I believe the way it was intended to be read, all those characters, all those stories of people having great faith and failing, I think we're being invited to understand ourselves that there will be times in our life where the dimmer switch is all the way up, where everything is clear and bright, and I'm just living the life of faith just as best as anyone could. And yet, maybe right around the corner, maybe the next day, maybe the next week, whatever it ends up being in your life, we have times where that dimmer switch might be at rock bottom, and it might even seem like the light is off.
Mm-hmm.
But that toggle switch is still on, right? I mean, that's the way dimmer switches work. And when I read through Hebrews chapter 11, the faith chapter, and it describes, it spends most time of all describing Moses, but it also lumps that group that left Egypt with him. It says in verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. The they there, that they is the same they that ends up deciding not to go into the promised land because the people were too big and wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years and were considered utter failures. But here, after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, the author of Hebrews, knowing their full story, calls that generation a generation of faith. At times they had great faith. I mean, think about what it would have taken, even on dry land, to walk through the Red Sea. Don't know what that looked like. Unbelievable faith. And yet it mimics my life in some ways, not to boast. I've had moments where I've trusted God greatly. And then I've also ultimately failed in faith with decisions placed before me and not trusting Him in certain areas of my life. And so, getting back to this topic of rest, how does that all play in?
Mm-hmm.
I think when we can learn to increase the dimmer switch of faith in our life up to full capacity and keep it up as long and in as many different areas of our life as possible, that is the life of rest that God is inviting us to. He's inviting us to not to try and figure it out on our own. He's already done the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
He's leading us to the place where He's designed us to be, not just in life in general, but every given day of our life.
And again,
this is where go ahead.
I think, to that, the person that I was talking with this week, in them, and I think this is biblical, in them, I think the turning on of the toggle switch, even though the dimmer was completely down, how that toggle switch gets turned on is just, again, it's that faith. It's that first step of coming to God. And this is where I say it's biblical, because it is. It's that step of the way I've described it, even recently, is those, like those stochastic static images that used to be in the malls in the 90s. And if you stare at it long enough and blur your eyes a little bit, you start seeing an image, and others won't see it. and they'll think you're crazy for what you're seeing. But those who see it get excited and they start describing it. But unless you try, you're not going to see it, and I like the analogy because, let's face it, there just are people that aren't seeing the image. And I mean that both literally in the stochastic image as well as in faith. And all we can do is kind of point them towards, if you just do this, if you take this step, but again, there's that level of faith that you've got to be willing to attempt it, to try it, to work through it, and some harder than others, but it is there. And it will, again, that dimmer switch will start going up the more you experience and have interaction and so on. And again, that's what I'm seeing with this person. It's exactly to what you're saying is, to them, maybe that dimmer switch, if it was on a scale of 1 to 10, is on like 0.5 right now, but that's enough for them to be excited enough to keep going. And pretty soon it'll be at a 2 and then a 3 and a 5 and, and so on. But that's all it takes. It's we've got to take a step in a sense, and God will respond. We see it. I see it just regularly in people's lives.
Yeah. And when we start thinking about rest, again, one of the main things that I hope people walk away from, if they end up reading the book or listening to my podcast about this topic of Sabbath, let's distance ourselves. Again, I'm not asking people to forget stuff or abandon things that they've got on board. I listened to another episode of your podcast. You talked about fulfillment being an addition to a fulfillment of something that existed. We're not abandoning it or getting rid of it. So Sabbath isn't something that we get rid of. We willingly then look at what Jesus said about it and say, this is really a bigger topic than what I do for physical work one day a week. That's the way it's been addressed historically.
Right.
That's the fourth commandment. But if you look biblically, this idea of rest really goes back to the ordering of creation and how God invited Adam, says he placed him in the garden in chapter 3. That word for place is a Hebrew word for rest. It could be translated, he rested Adam in the garden. In his special place of presence, Adam was in his place doing his thing. And to the extent that he continued in that for a period of time, he was at rest with God. He and Eve were at rest. And it's only when then we decide to step out of that order. So when we think about Sabbath, let's get away from the idea of a set of rules. Let's get away from the idea that it's one day a week, that we need to do something different. Jesus didn't say, I'm Lord of one day a week. He said, I'm Lord of this whole topic of rest. And it would be diminishing his statement if we tried to pigeonhole his Lordness of Sabbath to just one day of the week. It's got to be bigger than that.
Yeah.
And I think if Jesus was here, we'd say, hi, Jesus, because I'm on a first-name basis with him. And I say, just let us know kind of what we're dealing with here. And Jesus would say, yeah, I wasn't just talking about that little sliver of that picture of rest, that shadow of rest that the fourth commandment brings out. That gave a glimpse, but I'm offering something so much better. The author of Hebrews suggests there's something that remains. So let's not abandon it. If you've given up on Sabbath, the idea, because you felt it was a set of rules and it didn't fit, it cramped your style. Sabbath, the bigger theology, is not cramping anything. What cramps your style is if you go and try and run from that and do it yourself. That's when your style gets cramped and you become weary and heavy laden. And Jesus is just saying, come back to the way I created you. And there's a rest there that you can't experience on your own. And it's a great invitation.
Yeah.
And it's a good reminder to think, yeah, maybe it's worth rethinking this topic. Maybe it is that I grew up in a system that really focused in on just a small sliver of what rest is. And maybe we should go back and rethink and see how big this thing can get, and where am I weary and heavy laden in my current situation or circumstance.
You phrase it in your afterword, the 8th day. You say, we now understand that godly rest is not a lazy day in a hammock. It's really the ceasing of our own attempts to rule and our active engagement in the world using the gifts and talent God has given us. When we rule, subdue, cultivate, and keep within God's plan, we can experience the rest that's available through Christ. And I think that's a really good definition. I want to segue with that into one last piece here, because I think in all of this, as you've mentioned Hebrews several times, the author is telling us that these things, in a sense, these things of the Old Testament were the shadow of good things to come, right? They were not that we shouldn't take the Sabbath rest, but that it's more than what you think it is based on the story you read in the Old Testament. Not that we shouldn't live by the law, but that it's more than what these stories in the Old Testament describe the law as. And that's kind of what the theme throughout Hebrews gives us, is that there's more and greater of this to be seen. And Hebrews 10, verse 1, starts in saying that, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never be, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. And that's really the fulfillment of Christ, right? He's our fulfillment of all of those things, of the Sabbath rest, of the sacrifices. And what I wanted to, I guess, transition this in a little bit, now that we've defined the rest, I wanted to, in a sense, maybe nerd out with you for just a moment here, with the Plato talk that we started a little bit. And this verse here, to me, when you read just the beginning of that sentence, for since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, am I just wishing there was a classical education here to the Hebrews author, or is this directly taken from Plato and specifically the Republic with the shadow allegory of the cave?
Yeah. So great question. Are you reading into it, or is this an obvious reference into a Hellenized world that would have been very familiar with Plato, his work, and that analogy of the cave that you mentioned? And let me just say there are great debates about this, because I know that you are in a program or working your way through a program that studies the classical studies, the philosophic world of the day back then. And I got my doctorate from the same institution that you're attending.
Which is Knox Theological.
Which is Knox. Interestingly enough, so Knox has put together this classical studies, which the basis of the class, the Plato class there, would suggest that, we should take a look at the mentions of shadow within Scripture, because those mentions by the biblical authors were said into a culture that had an already existing metaphor for shadows. It was this Plato's cave analogy.
Right.
And my conclusion that I wanted to include in my doctoral thesis was that, yes, there is definitely a connection. And I had included it, and I'd written a summary of that chapter that I wanted to include. And I was told that there wasn't enough biblical research already on the books that would suggest I could document that well enough to include in my thesis. in my major project. And as I got into it, there are people out there that make these connections on a regular basis.
And
there is also, though.
Oh, go ahead.
But there is also a population within the theological world that does not want to make a connection between the biblical text and Hellenistic philosophy. They think that's damaging in some way to the text. And just everything I know about how the Bible was written is that it was written into the culture of its day. And it was stated throughout in many different cultures, but it was stated in terms that the original recipients of the message would have understood wholeheartedly because they were in that culture. John Walton is an author that helped me. He's an Old Testament scholar that helped me with some edits on my book. He talks about our culture being a cultural river. It's continually moving and changing. And the biblical authors were swimming in the cultural river of their day and wrote, again, two people swimming in the same cultural river, and they had to say it in terms. So the conclusion, that's why I included it in my book. I have a part of chapter 3 is about Plato explains the analogy of the cave for those that aren't familiar with it, and possibly the significance of how that philosophic thought in the Hellenized world would have naturally been playing out within Hellenized Christianity. And so the biblical authors aren't indebted, this is the way Walton says it, they're not indebted to the Hellenistic philosophic thought, but they're embedded within that world. And so there's no debt that the authors owe, but they are embedded within a world, and they had to explain the truth of Christ in terms that the world would have understood of the world of their day. So yes, I believe, so there's the one, Hebrews 10:1. There's Hebrews 8:5 also talks about now if he, Christ, were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those priests, in other words, who offer gifts according to the law and serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. And then there's Paul has one reference as well that I talk about in the book. I personally believe there's an obvious connection there that if you don't at least acknowledge that it could be a connection, I think you're doing a disservice to your study.
And to me, it's so when I was a freshman in college, and I had a philosophy 101, we learned Allegory of the Cave. And we learned it by a handout that the professor had given us. And it was basically, it was a shortened, it wasn't shortened as in condensed, but it wasn't the full book 7 of the Republic, right? It was just part of it. And just as a real quick, for the Allegory of the Cave, you have this, Plato or Socrates is talking about, imagine there's these people and they're facing a wall and they're in chains and they can't really look left or right, but only straight ahead. And what they see are shadows on the wall. And behind them is a bridge with people walking across it. And behind that is a fire that's casting the shadow of these people. And as they see the shadows of the people, they're trying to figure out what they are. And they're coming up with these things. I'm paraphrasing it right now, so forgive me if I'm skipping or not doing exact detail. But basically, now one of these prisoners breaks out of their chains and they ascend upward out of the cave. And not only do they see that the shadows that these people saw are actually people on a bridge walking to and fro, and there's a light casting that shadow on the wall. But then as they ascend out of the cave, they see that there's trees and there's a greater source of light, which is the sun. And there's a whole nother world outside of this cave. And that's about what I got. Then when I was in graduate school at Knox, and we went through the Republic, and we went through it in, a whole semester. So we spent a lot of time. And I get to this part afterwards where Socrates says, "Now, what do you suppose would happen if that person who ascended out of the cave came back down and told those prisoners, hey, break free of your chains. There's this whole other world up there. Let's go do that." The response is, well, they would probably think he was mad and they would kill him. And I got chills, and obviously the professor was talking this towards that direction of, do you see the connection here? Are you making this connection? And I was like, oh my God, this is a prophetic utterance of Christ. Now, add to this that the Republic is written after Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, and before Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, or any of the Gospels. But it's basically in that what we call the silent period, right? Between no longer Old Testament writings, but not yet New Testament writings. And we have this Greek philosophy written, wedged in between there, not to mention what the Republic deals with is the philosopher king, which to me is another screaming prophecy of Christ. But just that story alone, the allegory, I ended up after that course thinking, there's a divine inspiration to Plato's Republic. And it's, to me, the way I put it, an understanding. I don't know if it was a revelation, but an inspiration, something where he was painting an image of Christ, but he didn't know what he was painting. And he didn't realize what he had found. And in a sense, at the end of the Republic, when we get to this, how do we create this perfect city? Well, we must have a ruling king who's also a philosopher, basically the king who doesn't want to be king and is benevolent and is this perfect person. Well, we don't find him on earth, so where can we look but the heavens, is what he says in the end of the Republic. And I'm just struck with that and thinking, oh my God, this is preparing the Greek world for the coming Christ, so that when John now talks about the Logos, they understand. They can make that connection. I think God was preparing the world for Christ through these writings. Some people think no one's ever said I'm a heretic for saying that, but they think I'm crazy or I'm reading too much into it. I'm too sympathetic for Plato or whatever, but I can't stop thinking that way. And then when I start reading Hebrews, and to your point, chapters 8 and chapters 10, and they're talking about shadows and forms and realities, and then again, John and the Logos, and I'm thinking, oh, come on, how much more obvious do we have to connect these dots to see that all of this is tied together, that God in his sovereignty, his mercy, his benevolence, his wisdom was preparing the world, not just the Jewish world, but was preparing all of the world for the acceptance of Christ and understanding of him. And I think Plato nailed it. I don't think he understood what he found, but I think he got there from the standpoint of this is what the world needs.
Yeah, I mean, people that haven't read the Republic or studied it don't have a clue how fascinating it is and what a great piece of literature it is. But there's one conclusion he came to in trying to create, it's all about politics, trying to create this perfect society, what would a perfect society look like? And one of the points he makes is everybody does one task. They get really good at one thing that they do and they stick to that. They don't try and multitask because they just do one thing. Like, I make shoes. I'm going to make shoes the best way I can. I'm going to get as good as I can. I'm going to do it for everybody. And that was one of the things. Everybody needs to find their place and the thing that they do, which is similar. If you go back in the Old Testament, and I'm going to make a stretch here and then tie it together. In the Old Testament, you've got a distinction between offices. And you've got the office of prophet, and then you've got the office of priest, and then you've got the office of king. And those three offices are all Messiah offices. They're all anointed offices of God, prophet, priest, and king. And a distinction is made in the Old Testament that the king and the priest should never be the same person. You should never have a priest who is a king or a king that acts like a priest. Yep. In fact, that's how Saul lost his anointing, is because he didn't wait for the priest to come and give the sacrifice. for the war that he was about to go into. So Saul crosses that boundary and takes on two roles, and his anointing, his messiahship, lowercase m, is removed. And David is given that next anointing. You've got that in the Old Testament. And then you've got philosophy in the 300s BC, in that intertestamental period, coming up with this idea of you need to be one thing, a philosopher or a king. And those people will be gifted different ways, and you should only be one, right? But really, the conclusion that like you said, the philosopher comes to is somebody's got to come up and take on two roles.
Mm-hmm.
Because the best king is also going to be the best philosopher. And it's going to take that unique person that can be the philosopher and the king. And in the biblical record, what Jesus does is he comes and combines the roles from the Old Testament that were always supposed to be separated, priest, king, and prophet. And he becomes the King of Kings.
Yep.
And he becomes the high priest. And he is the greatest of all prophets. And when you see those two things put side by side, the conclusions that philosophic thought, secular philosophic thought came to in the intertestamental period, and then the story that the Bible is presenting, having some similarities, what a brilliant God we have.
Yeah.
To weave those things together.
Because truth is truth. And if you go seeking it, you'll find it. Again, I think to some extent, this is why the revelation of Christ is important, because you may not know what you found, but it's going to paint the same picture, and then when you meet Jesus, you say, that's it. That's him right there. Who did what was the book of, wasn't there like Socrates and Jesus conversation book, when Socrates met Jesus or something like that? Or a play about this? Do you know what know? I'll have to look it up, and I'll send you something about it.
Somebody's tried it. That would be very interesting.
I think I'm not. It might be a play, not a book, but like a screenplay or a play that you read or whatever. But it's very interesting because from what I'm remembering, this is what it deals with, is kind of that, finding the truth, and basically how a conversation between Socrates and Jesus would basically lead Socrates to Jesus, which is a great thought experiment. But anyway, this has been great, Greg. I really enjoyed this. How can, leaving on a note, how can people get in touch with you, get the book? What's the best way to reach out if they want to talk with you? Yeah.
So the book is available online, easy, Amazon, ChristianBooks.com, Barnes & Noble, any of those places. Again, it's called Rethinking Rest, Why Our Approach to Sabbath Isn't Working. Kind of a play on words there, kind of like that. And I've got a website that goes along with that book, rethinkingrest.com. And the cool thing about this book is I've got QR codes in it. And did you get the Kindle version?
I did.
Is that what? Yeah, and the QR codes show up in the Kindle version? At the beginning of each chapter?
No.
Oh, okay. I got to look into that. I haven't, it just came out on Kindle recently, and so I haven't had a chance to follow up with that.
Oh, wait a minute. You know what? It is there, additional resources, and there is a QR code. Okay.
Okay, perfect. So I've got a full small group study that goes along with every chapter of the book that I did as a pastor myself, and I've made that available online for free. And so if somebody wants to get the book and read through it and think, oh, I've got a small group that would love to go through this, all of that is available at rethinkingrest.com. The other way that you can interact with me is my podcast, Rethinking Scripture. And I've got the associated website for that, rethinkingscripture.com. So those are some things. Last thing I'll mention, just because it's coming up, I put an Israel trip together, and I got John Walton to be a co-host of the trip. He's the Old Testament scholar from Wheaton that just retired and has agreed to be a co-host on my February 2024 trip to the Holy Land. And we've only got a few spots left. So if anybody's interested in that, you can go to my website and look me up and contact me, and I'll get you in touch with more info.
That sounds great. I may look into that, actually.
Yeah. No, we've got like between 5 and 10 spots left, and they're going to fill up sometime this summer.
Okay.
Probably quicker rather than slower.
And that's February 24th, so this coming winter.
Yep, this coming February. Yep.
All right, great. Well, again, thanks a lot, Greg, for being a part of this conversation. This was good. It's not often that I'm doing a book, Christian author with a book. Usually it's an atheist with a book or something like that, and we're being more combative. But again, I thought the book was great, and I found it very insightful in some passages and things. I found it confirming to what I do believe. So that's always nice when someone much smarter than myself can put it together in words and study. Go check out the book. I think you'll find it's definitely worth your time and helps give you a better understanding of that peace in Christ that we need.
Like what you hear? Hate what you hear? Have some thoughts you'd like to get off your chest? We want to hear from you. Contact us at johnchristie.com and be a guest.